Hey guys, welcome back to the neighborhood. It's your friendly neighborhood reviewer with inToit Reviews. And thanks to Final Audio, I've got both the A4000 and the B3 in the house for reviews. Today, we're taking a look at the newer offering and the more economical of the two, the A4000. And with only a 6mm dynamic driver and a price tag of $160, can the A4000 keep up with other in-ear monitors in this price range? Let's get into it. So the build here is pretty special, but maybe not in a way that most people would be expecting from Final Audio. The design here is one that promotes function and form over placing an emphasis on bouginess or fancy external aesthetics. To start with, these are extremely lightweight in just about every facet from the shell to the cable. The shell is comprised of an ABS soft touch plastic. It is in the same size and shape as their B series or the A8000, but since it's made out of plastic, it's much lighter. These rest in my ears and I barely feel that they're even there. I could probably wear these all day without any comfort issues whatsoever. Be aware that the nozzle is on the shorter side and the smaller side, but it has a nice lip to hold onto the provided Type E silicone tips, which are some of my favorite ear tips and aid this set with its comfort. Although I experimented with alternative tips in my testing, I found the Type E tips to sound the best, so it's nice that they come in the package here. These Type E tips are normally decently pricey. At the time of this review, they cost about $20 on Amazon for the same case and set of 5 tips that come supplied in the box here. But for your reference, what comes with the A4000 is a set of SS, small, medium, large, and LL size Type E silicones. The cable here doesn't look like much, but is one of my favorite cables of all time. It's a straight 2-cord OFC cable which terminates in a nice sized right-angled 3.5mm TRS connection with some nice rubberized strain relief as well. The cable initiates at the shell in what is listed to be a properly recessed 2-pin 0.78 standard connector, but I will note that I was not able to fit other recessed 2-pin cables on this set, as the divot here is much deeper grooved than normal. Further, its corresponding plastic tongue on the inside of the connector of the IM itself would not allow for alternative cables to slide in properly, at least not the ones that I have. While it might be possible to shave the plastic down or force an alternative cable in, I was unwilling to do so here out of fears of damaging this set. So it's a positive turn of fate for Final that I really do like this cable, because in most cases I'd be turned off by its connection being at least somewhat proprietary here. What I love about this cable is that it's basically untangleable. Not that I recommend it, but you can ball it up with the IM, throw them both in your pocket, pull them out, and the cable just falls out almost seamlessly perfectly without kink, memory, or other issue, returning to a relatively flat state almost every time. People have trumped up the Moondrop SSR and SSP cables as playing similarly when in use, but honestly, this cable is at least twice as good as either of those. It feels more lightweight, and unlike the Moondrop cable, there's a fully functional chin slider that holds tension well and is integrated to the Y-split on the Final cable. Final also provides locking but removable silicone ear hooks with this cable, which supposedly help with microphonics, but I didn't find the cable to be particularly microphonic on its own either. These silicone ear hooks did improve the fit and comfort of the A4000, however, and were surprisingly easy and without nuisance to use. Furthermore, these silicone ear hooks are softer to the touch and much more comfortable than the plastic that is generally used in the manufacturing of preformed ear hooks these days. And before I forget, Final also includes a very nice, appropriately sized, easy to use silicone carry case to protect your in-ear monitors as well. The inverted silicone dome on the underside of the case provides support for your IEMs so that they don't move around too much or bang too much against each other during transport. In general, Final has put form and user experience first with this set and largely put together a package here that functions well within practical use case scenarios, even if it isn't the fanciest construction like some of their other sets. So now that we've thoroughly covered the build, let's finally get to the sound. Timbre here is relatively neutral, but bright leaning. It's not as neutral as something like Final's own B3, and it's probably a smidge brighter than the Chauzy Rouge, but it's not brittle by any stretch of the imagination either. In fact, tonality and technical ability here reminds me a lot of the Chauzy Rouge and the ICO OH10. Two other sets that are similarly priced, but unlike those sets, which are hybrids, making use of dynamic and balanced armature drivers, the A4000 uses only a single 6mm dynamic. So in the case of the A4000, there's a lot of sound coming out of a tiny driver. And in terms of detail, resolution, and clarity, I'd say that the A4000 at least keeps up with the other sets, which, given its type of driver and its size, I found to be astounding. With specific regard to tuning, I'd describe these as a weeb's wet dream. Or put another way, these are the SSP that the community wanted from Moondrop but never got. The treble here has a good amount of airiness to it, and it extends well overall. In comparison to the ICO OH10, the treble is a bit more present and slightly sharper in quality, but I never really felt the emergence of any treble glare. Instead, the treble was clear and focused, and although it rubbed up against my upper tolerance limit with regard to its accentuation, it was fairly unfatiguing overall to my ears. For instance, rim shots on the song Black or White by Michael Jackson were prominent, but not overdone and relatively realistic sounding still. Nevertheless, some people might find these to have a bit too much energy or be elevated a tad too high in the shouty range or the upper mid-range and lower treble. That is, if one is particularly sensitive to shout here. I also found some very mild sibilance on the track ILY2 by Charlie XCX, but I didn't find this sibilance to be of the overly unnatural variety. On this song, there were hints of sibilance in the T range, but not in the S sphere. To be specific, there was some mild harshness on the phrasing when Charlie repeats or recites the line, talk a lot, but I'm ultimately unsure if this would be something that most listeners would pick up on. Overall, I'd say that the treble flows smoothly and there is a decent amount of air here, that is, without going overboard into artificiality. In terms of the mids, for the most part, I also found the mid-range to sound as transparent, clean, and engaging as the treble did, with the only exception being the lower mid-range at times, which on graphs, it seems, rises a little bit too slowly to meet my preference levels. Auditorily, this causes the lower portion of the mid-range to sound less forward than one might expect it to sound on particular tracks. In other words, the mid-range sounded somewhat shallow or scooped on occasion. Lower-toned guitars and lower-timbred male vocals were particularly vulnerable at times and came across as less pronounced than their higher-toned or higher-pitched counterparts, such as in the case of female vocals, which in comparison were spotlighted well by the A4000 and sparkled well for the listener. For instance, the main guitar riff on Of Wolf and Man by Metallica off the Black Album and Immigrant Song by Led Zeppelin off Led Zeppelin 3 were a bit recessed and less in your face than they would be on other sets. The track My Love by Lionel Richie also depicted this loss of energy, as the intensity of his vocal performance goes in and out when played back on the A4000. Nevertheless, this lack of energy was only observed on certain tracks, and it's not something that would prevent me from buying this set, as its clarity across the board makes up for it. In other words, despite some lethargy in the lower mid-range prominence at times, Sonics were always audibly clear, even if they lacked some energy from this portion of the range in particular every now and again. The bass is extremely fast, punchy, tight, and upon first listen may appear somewhat lean, but instead of referring to it as lean, I would classify it as nimble. What I mean by this is there is enough sub-bass presence for most genres, and it comes out in the mix when it's called for, but there is some definite roll-off towards the tail of the bottom end, and the bass seems to always present itself from beneath the vocals. Much of the bass energy here in the A4000 is thus derived from the mid-bass region, but executed somewhat masterfully by Final here, without any trace of bloat, bleed, or overly elevated intensity. These sound like a well-tuned 10-inch subwoofer in an audiophile 2-channel setup, thumpy and musical. Bass clarity isn't what I would call in-game because the sub-bass does resolve a tad too quickly on some bass-centric tracks, but bass detailing is well done and better than most at this price point. Yet, bass heads and listeners whose playlists focus on rap and other similar genres may be left yearning for some additional bass presence from the A4000, because this is more of a sophisticated bass tuning, implemented not for wow factor but for balance, to generally enhance and mostly never detract from the overall presentation. Overall, I would describe the A4000's bass as punchy and pleasing without ever being domineering. But let's move on to the Soundstage, as this will be one of the main reasons for most audiophiles to purchase the final A4000. The staging here is wondrous. The sound is open and airy, spacious and vast, like taking a swim in the ocean. They excel at separation of instruments, instrument distinction, placement, and other imaging characteristics. Decay in particular is a strength of the A4000 and done mostly well from the top to the bottom of the frequency response range, with only some mild chinks in the armor with specific regard to its sub-bass decay, which is still better than average and sufficient enough for most genres. Peripherals are just as detailed as the rest, and I was awestruck by the definition and detailed nature of the stage on a number of test tracks, even on busier tracks which have a tendency to confuse other sets. For example, each note came across individually and with stellar definition on Pearl Jam's Crazy Mary, and Creep by the Stone Temple Pilots, which can sometimes come across as compressed, was another song that seemingly was well mastered for this set. The stage on Back to Life by Haley Steinfeld from the Bumblebee soundtrack felt almost immeasurable when listening on the A4000. Power sourcing was somewhat important, however, as it did impact both staging and imaging. So this is an IEM that you're going to want to find an appropriate source with appropriate synergy to it. My favorite sources were the Goldnote DS10 Plus, the FIO BTR3K, and the Drop THX AAA 789. But it also sounded pretty great off my phone, while the staging was somewhat squashed and imaging capabilities restricted on the ZenCan Signature in comparison. The A4000 was also somewhat sensitive to high output impedances, which was a surprise from Final for me, given that some of their other IEMs such as the B3, which mind you use balanced armature drivers, are less sensitive than this one. Nevertheless, the A4000 performed remarkably well on low impedance sources, and potential high impedance issues were easily remedied by an iFi IE match on the high setting. To summarize my findings, the final A4000 is one of my favorite IEMs in the price range, and it's a must consider for anyone who wants to experience stellar staging in an IEM at a reasonable price. To date, many others have analogized the A4000 to the HD800 in terms of comparing this IEM to a headphone, and I'm finding it hard to disagree. But in the case of the A4000, tonality is more on point and the overall sound profile comes across as more natural to my ear. Yet, it goes without saying that the A4000 doesn't quite live up to the resolution capabilities of the Sennheiser HD800, as in any case, its resolution is more equitable with its price. Nevertheless, aside from some lack of emphasis in the lower mid-range, Tonal balance is pretty spot on in the A4000, and it's similar to the ICO OH10, where the frequency response is tuned in a manner that most should enjoy, albeit with somewhat less thunderous and less accentuated low end in comparison to the ICO. Also, unlike the OH10, the A4000 is more suited to portable carry due to its emphasis on function over aesthetics, including a lighter weight, more comfortable fit, extremely manageable cable, and other considerations by Final. In the case of the A4000, Final Audio seems to have put a lot of thought into this IEM from its design to its accessories, and it shows both in terms of its listen and its use. Overall, the A4000 is a superb everyday carry IEM that is easy for this reviewer to recommend for its $160 price tag. And just a reminder, guys, make sure to hit like, subscribe, leave some comments, and follow the neighborhood at all its other access locations at Twitter, the blog, Instagram, the Discord, or become a Patreon. This review was posted on the Patreon for a number of weeks in written format prior to this review. So if you want to hear the first word from me on IEMs and other audio products such as this one, make sure to become a Patreon for only $1.50 a month. It will get you access to early written blog reviews from me. And with that, I'm out for now.